Hi and welcome to the first video on OpenJVS. I'm going to try and explain how to use it and how to write your own map files so you can all play games with controllers. So firstly we're going to set up the cable. You need a USB cable and you need to strip that down. You've got a black, white, pink and green wire. Then you need to get a USB to RS485 converter and you need a screwdriver as well. And then you need to wire the black and red wires from the USB into the RS485 converter ground. Then you want to wire white to B minus and green to A plus, like that. What I did with mine is plugged it into a little USB extender and then plugged that end into the Raspberry Pi, which gave me a nice long cable that I could use. You then also plug your controller into your Raspberry Pi, and then you plug the other end into your Naomi. This is just a little setup. I've got the Raspberry Pi here plugged into Naomi and the network, and plugged into the controller, and the Naomi is turned on. So now we get into a bit of the software. I've SSH'd into the Raspberry Pi here, and firstly what we want to do is install the right software. So we're going to use apt to install the build essential package, git and evtest, which will allow us to make map files. So that's installing now. Yours probably say more, seeing as I already have it installed, but just tell it that that's fine. Then you want to git clone the repository, which is github.com/bobbydilly/openjvs. And then, as you'll see there, that's made a folder called OpenJVS, which we can go into. And you'll see all the project files there. What we want to do is run the make command, and if everything goes successful, that should build the project. And now we're ready to start running. So you want to install it. If you're in the scripts folder, you can just run the install command and that will copy it to your Raspberry Pi so you can run it from anywhere. And yeah. Now I'm going to configure the device and the controllers. So you need to be marginally Linux savvy for this. In the dev directory, this is where all your serial devices are. So your USB to RS485 converter is a serial device, and normally it would be called T2Y USB 0, as long as you've got nothing else plugged in. And then in dev input, this is where all your input devices are, and then labeled event and then a number. So because I've only got one controller, the PlayStation 4 one in, it's event 0. You can also look at the by ID directory to see them as well. So now we're going to set up the config files. So if you go into the .openjvs directory, which is in your home directory, you'll see there's a global config file. Here you can set up the device path, the keyboard path, mouse path, and controller path. For the controller path, I've just got it set to event 0, so that's the first device you've got plugged in. And device path, I've got it set to dev T2Y USB 0, so that's the first serial device you plugged in. And because I've only got the one device, that's fine. So now we need to find out the controller values. So we use evtest for that. So what you want to do is just go out and run sudo evtest. It will show you the device you got plugged in, and you just want to type 0, and that will show you all the things the device is sending. My device is quite wobbly. The thumb controller gives you lots of different values, so loads of stuff's coming out there. But what I normally like to do is use grep. So we're looking for these codes here. This is the number that you should use in the settings files. So you can also give evtest the path to the device. So I've given it the path event 0, and we're grepping for ev key. So these are the buttons. They give an ev key event, and we can see here when I'm pressing the buttons on the PlayStation controller, it gives us all the different codes. So 305 there is X, and that's what I'll use later to set the X button to start. Then we've got grep for ev abs, which is the sort of analog values it gives you there. And the different codes there are the different analog values we get. So what you can do just to make sure you're on the right one is grep for one of the codes. So grep for code 4. Now when I press the accelerator on the back of the PlayStation 4 controller, we can see the values it gives us. Now you want to make sure you remember the values because we'll need to use those later. We want the values to be between 0 and 255. So I'm just going to do a little pre-talk now, which I've written afterwards, about the controllers because the next bit's a bit complicated. So the analog values for the controllers give you numbers, and for the Naomi, it wants the numbers between 0 and 255. However, the controller numbers for the analog that it gives you out could be between sort of minus 128 or 128. They could be between 0 and 1024. And that's where we use the add and max values for the ABS binding commands. And so what happens is, imagine we had the controller giving between minus 128 and 128. What we'd do is we'd set the add value to 128, so it adds 128 to all those values, which now gets them between 0 and 255. We then set the max value to 255 so that I know how to scale it in the software. So for example, if you had a controller that was giving you between 0 and 1024, you'd set the add value to 0 because we don't need to add anything because 0 is our minimum, and we'd set the max value to 1024 so that the software would know that the controller might be giving the value of 1024, and we can scale that down to 255 for the Naomi. So hopefully that sort of explains what the next bit is about. I go over it a bit quickly, and I would recommend you probably look at the README quite closely, as that probably explains it better. So we'll create the map file now. In the maps directory, you just want to make a file. I'm going to call mine crazy_taxi-ps4 because it's got the name of the game and the controller that we're using. You can make comments using a hash. So I'm just going to comment everything out to start with. So I've given a title, which is generally useful, and then we'll comment the start button, the accelerator, the brake, and finally the steering in a second. And then what we're going to do is refer to the instructions which are on the README on the GitHub repository. So if you scroll down here, you'll see that there's the config instructions, and it shows you how to, here's the config reference, key bindings and the ABS bindings, which are the sort of analog values. So first we'll do a key bind, so we just give it the controller key code. So I'll type here controller_key_bind. I'll give it the controller key code, which is 305. I'll then give it the player that this responds to, which is player number 1, and then we'll give it the button on the Naomi, which is button 0. So then it's similar for the ABS bind. However, we've got a little add and max thing. What that does is adds to the value. So if the value is between minus 50 and 50, you'd want to add 50 to make it between minus 0 and 100, and then you set the max to 100. So here I've gone controller_ABS_bind. Number 4 is the analog value from the controller. Number 1 is the value on the Naomi, so analog channel 1. Because the values were between 0 and 255 already, we set add to 0 because we don't need to add anything, and we set max to 255. So I've done that for the brake and steering as well there. Now if we just go ahead and save that, we can go ahead and run it, which is the most exciting part. So if we go back into the OpenJVS directory and go into the scripts folder, we can use run with raw mode for our Raspberry Pi. That just makes sure it works properly on a Raspberry Pi. You don't need to do that on any other computer, but you just run that and then give it the name of the map files, Crazy Taxi PS4, and we can see that it's using that map. So I've gone into the Crazy Taxi test menu here, which is generally useful for debugging, and you can see when we move the values on the PlayStation controller, it changes the values on the test file. What you might see is it's saying error checksum problem. That's fine, as long as it doesn't say that all the time, you'll be fine. If it does say that all the time, it means the game probably doesn't work with a Raspberry Pi, and so you could use a more beefy Linux computer. But so that's running, and I'll just show a little bit of gameplay here. It's quite hard to play with one hand, but I'll select my character, and then Crazy Taxi actually does have a reverse gear, which we haven't put in yet. But you can see now that we can drive the car around using the controller. It would be good for reverse gear if you could toggle reverse or drive. The config files don't support anything that complicated yet, but if you just send me a message on what you think the config file should be able to support, then I can get that added in. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope that everyone is able to use it and it works well. If you need any help, please feel free to contact me. It's still in development, so there's loads of stuff that I still want to add to it. You can either contact me on YouTube you can look at my website dilly.io for more contact ways, or the arcade projects forum that this is on. So just as a last comment, it's probably better to have the least things plugged into your Raspberry Pi as possible, because they take up the bandwidth and that could ruin the game. And also the OpenJVS software needs to be running before you start the game or enter the test mode, or it won't work, because the Naomi asks the JVS device if it's there, and if it's not, the Naomi will never ask it again. So that's just something to keep in mind.